So when we speculate about reality, when we want to make judgment about the orders of the real, there are four concepts that are rather useful. Basically, these four concepts divide in themselves as a totality this order of reality. And they are impossible, possible, probable, and necessary. Now, what is impossible is something that contains a total contradiction, either some analytical contradiction, logical contradiction, or something that goes against material logic. An example, a simple one, is a square circle, because the definition of the square and the definition of the circle prohibits that square and circle would anyhow fit together. So when we can hear the idea of a square circle, but we judge that it is impossible because they have opposite characteristics, we cannot be combined. Another impossibility of material kind would be the impossibility of the unicorn. And we define that the unicorn is impossible because mammals cannot have one horn. So, and plus horses don't have horns anyhow. So we decide that therefore there is an impossibility, but it's more an empirical impossibility. It has to do with material logic. Yeah? So that is the impossible. Then we move to the possible. Now what's interesting here is that the shift between impossible and possible can be very, very tiny, to the extent we could confuse the impossible and the possible. I'll give you an example. For example, here now I'm walking in the woods, and I can say it is possible that I find a bag with €1,000,000. Why it's possible? Because nothing, either in logic or in material logic, prohibits that such a thing would be done, that such a thing would exist. I can invent all kind of story. Somebody who stole €1,000,000 left it there or dropped it there, and there I found it. Yeah? So of course, this possibility, somebody with a little bit of common sense would tell me, well, no, that's impossible. Well, it's true that it's impossible, but it's to speak in a very approximative way, because in the absolute it is possible. Now it is, its probability, its possibility is very, very, very small, to the extent that I can decide that it is for all practical purposes impossible. But that's from a practical standpoint. But from a purely logical standpoint, nothing prohibits the fact I would find €1,000,000 in the middle of the woods, right? But possible can be a little bit more possible than this quasi-impossibility I just told you. For example, it is possible that I meet a friend I have not met for 20 years tomorrow. Now, I have no reason to think he's going to come, but it's possible. The possibility of it is wider, it's larger than the possibility of finding €1,000,000, even though it's still very little. There's very little possibility. So you see that there's a notion of degree. Between impossible and possible, it's not a matter of degree. It's a matter of statute. One is prohibited, it's impossible. One is not prohibited, so it's possible, even though possibility are very limited. But we see that there's some asymptotic curve where the possible almost can reach the impossible, but still there's a discontinuity between the impossible and the possible. Then the possibility can become more and more possible. I can think of something possible that is more possible than an old friend I haven't seen for 20 years coming by, or the €1,000,000. But at a certain point, if I increase the degree of possibility, we reach something where it becomes probable. Now, I'm not an expert in weather. I can say it's possible that it rains tomorrow or it doesn't rain tomorrow. Well, let's say it's 50-50 because I know nothing about the weather, and it's still possible because I have no strong reasons to believe that it will happen. So, but it's 1 out of 2. That's a rather good possibility. But 1 out of 2 even though it is a good possibility, cannot be called probable. See, probable, of course, there's no specific threshold, there's no specific degree or quantity or proportion after which it is called probable. But probable, let's just do, for the fun of the exercise, say it would have to be like 90%, 95%, yes, of chance something would happen, and then I could say it is probable. So something is probable where common sense, laws of logic, laws of science, common knowledge could say, yes, this should happen. Then it's called probable. Now, the funny thing is that in many languages, in Chinese, there's no distinction between the possible and the probable. And even in languages like English, French, or Russian, when there are words to distinguish possible and probable, very often people don't really distinguish possible and probable. But it's very important, because to say, well, it's possible, can be very meaningless if it's only to exclude impossibility, when if it's to say it's probable, it starts having some real meaning. Now what becomes interesting is the distinction between probable and necessary. Because again, just like between possible and impossible, often people don't make the distinction between probable and necessary. For example, I make an appointment with a friend and I tell him I will definitely be there. Like it's sure. That's what is called necessity. It cannot be otherwise. Well, in the Muslim world, they say inshallah, which means if God wants. Why? Because all kind of things could happen. A priori, I don't see any reason not to be there. And I don't see any reason why I should not be alive, where my friend should not be alive, or nothing stops me from going there. But as we all know, there are events that we cannot predict, which are called accidents. So it is highly probable that if I tell my friend I'm going to meet him tomorrow in a place that's not very far, it's not very complicated to go there, most likely I will be there, and he will be surprised if I don't show up. I will be surprised if he doesn't show up, because we take it for granted. But still, it is not necessary. It is not for sure that it will take place, because I can break my leg, because my friend can have suddenly something urgent to do. Right? Therefore, I cannot say it's necessary. If I say that a square has 4 sides, that is necessary. That is not probable, because it's in the definition of a square to have 4 sides. If I say that to be alive, you need to have oxygen arriving to the blood, again, that's not a logical necessity, but that's a material necessity in general. Of course, we can always invent some rare exception that science can invent, but basically, if a human being is alive, he must be able to breathe and have oxygen arriving to the blood. So it is more of the order of necessity. Yeah? So sometimes the probability can be very, very strong, very high, but still it's not necessity. Just like for impossibility, necessity implies that it cannot be otherwise. There has to be something of a formal logic or something of a material logic that prohibits to be otherwise. So as we see all these different degrees, all these different concepts, impossible, possible, probable, necessary, are very useful to make judgments about the orders of reality, but it is rather easy to confuse them one to the other, to make one slide on the other, like the impossible and the barely possible, the possible which is quite possible, but is not probable. It's not probable. Why? Because there's at least 2 possibilities, like the fact tomorrow it will rain or not rain. There are 2 possibilities, so it's not probable. To be probable, it basically has to tend to exclude other possibility or make them very weak. And then between the possible and the necessary again, because something looks rather obvious and we'll say it's necessary, but we forget that there might be some accidents prohibiting it. So these are very useful concepts, but they tend to have a continuous relation, so we have to be attentive to how we use them in order to make an appropriate judgment. So that's basically it.